Jasmine Crockett's heart pounded as she stepped into the cramped debate hall, where the heavy press of bodies, the blinding overhead lights, and the undercurrent of hostility in the air all coalesced into a moment that felt as though it had been scripted by forces beyond anyone's control. She was late, 12 minutes to be exact, and the mood had already turned sour. Several onlookers were whispering behind their hands, exchanging glances that combined disbelief and contempt. Others simply wore the stony expressions of people who expected disappointment. The instant Jasmine's shoes clicked against the worn floor, a laugh rippled through one side of the room. It was a sneering, dismissive sound, cutting through the charged hush like a scythe. The moderator, whose nameplate identified him as Alden Caraway, simply raised his eyebrows. He wore the faintest trace of a smirk, as if relishing her apparent stumble. In that one moment, the tension was so thick it seemed to distort the air. She paused, inhaled slowly, and locked eyes with Alden, determined not to let the laughter define her. Outside, the day was bright, the sky open and inviting, but inside these four walls, the atmosphere was as stifling as a sealed courtroom whose verdict had already been decided by prejudice. She walked to her designated stand at the front of the room, ignoring the condescending smiles that radiated from the cluster of officials seated at a long table draped with the city's emblem. The city council members sat rigidly, hands folded or clasped around pens. A few scribbled notes, presumably about her tardiness or about the hush that fell every time she inhaled. No one invited her to speak just yet, so she stood silent, letting the hush become a tangible presence. The cameras that dotted the back row filmed everything meticulously, capturing every flicker of her eyes. The press, practically vibrating with the promise of controversy, hovered in rows of chairs angled at the dais. This was all part of a larger spectacle, and the watchers' expressions suggested they were ready for a takedown. Jasmine felt her throat constrict with a rush of indignation at the spectacle being set against her. She closed her eyes, only for a fleeting moment, to center herself. The hush thickened. When she opened them, she saw Alden leaning forward. He tapped his microphone, then looked straight at her. He cleared his throat in a showy manner that signaled his intent to command the room's attention. "We appreciate you finally making it here," he said, voice as smooth as polished marble. The smirk did not vanish from his lips. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging his words. A wave of faint snickering arose from a corner of the audience, quickly dying away when she lifted her head again. There was nothing comedic in her expression. There was only a resolute calm that suggested she had endured far worse. They had tried to unnerve her before, but never quite like this. Alden continued, "I hope this won't become a habit, Miss Crockett." His condescending tone was carefully measured, a slight tilt of the voice that signaled his power. A mild hush followed, and then, to Jasmine's surprise, a single clap came from somewhere in the second row, sarcastic applause punctuating the moment with a dash of cruelty. Jasmine did not respond to it. She let it pass. With her opening line yet to be spoken, she stood in the crosshairs of the city's leadership and a hungry press corps that wanted an underdog's meltdown. She knew the environment, a combination of performative decorum and unspoken intimidation. It felt akin to stepping into a courtroom where the judge openly detested her, where every statement she made would be twisted or belittled. But that knowledge only steeled her further. Alden gave a perfunctory glance toward a clock on the wall. "Since you are present, we should proceed," he said, flipping through a set of notes on the table. The crisp pages in his hands made an almost scornful rustle. "We've all gathered to discuss the reports you submitted last week, the ones regarding alleged misconduct by certain elected officials in this city." A murmur passed through the chamber at the mention of misconduct. He paused, letting the words sink in. "But first," he continued, "we'd like you to explain your tardiness. Given the seriousness of your accusations and the gravity of this forum, you surely understand why every moment matters." He ended his statement on a self-righteous note, certain that the audience would side with him in the silent condemnation of her. Jasmine lifted her chin and clasped her hands on the wooden stand. If this was a performance, she had to deliver her line. She spoke slowly, letting her measured calm cut through the tension. "I do appreciate time," she said, her voice low but distinct. "And I also understand that truth has its own schedule. I assure you my lateness was not out of disrespect but out of necessity." Another strained laugh rose from the same pocket of onlookers, as if they were determined to pounce on any perceived grandstanding. She did not turn to face them. Instead, she let her words rest in the space between herself and Alden, letting them serve as her first marker of composure. Alden set down his notes, and for a fraction of a second he seemed almost unsettled by her directness. He chose not to comment on her explanation. Instead, he motioned to a different official at the table, an older woman with sharp eyes and a stern countenance. "Councilwoman Monroe, I believe you had questions for Miss Crockett?" Alden said, his tone implying that this was a chore, a mere formality. Councilwoman Monroe cleared her throat softly, adjusting her posture. She wore a steel-gray blazer, and her hand moved to a thin file in front of her, which she tapped twice, as though summoning courage or calm. "I do, yes." "Miss Crockett, can you confirm for the record you have alleged that certain city officials, including but not limited to members of this council, engaged in the deliberate concealment of public records specifically regarding property transfers and budget appropriations over the last 5 years? Is that correct?" Jasmine inclined her head. "That's correct, Councilwoman. And do you have proof of these allegations?" Monroe pressed, her voice quiet but saturated with that unwavering sense of skepticism. Jasmine paused, letting the silence expand for a moment. She heard a few faint coughs from the audience, as if people were preparing themselves for a wave of sensational claims. She stared at the woman, whose posture radiated a desire to quell any possible scandal. "I've brought evidence," Jasmine said at last, her voice steady, "including the official budget statements, internal emails, and notarized testimonies from individuals who witnessed the manipulation firsthand." A few camera shutters clicked from behind the rows of seats. Now the thick hush returned, the tension coiling tighter. Councilwoman Monroe arched an eyebrow, her gaze drifting momentarily to Alden. "I see," she said. "We will request you submit any such documents to this committee for review, but in the meantime, the public wants to know why you believe the city's leadership is complicit in wrongdoing. You have indicated that bribery might be involved. Do you intend to stand by that claim now?" The question felt like a net cast wide to entrap her into a sensational soundbite. Jasmine exhaled, bracing herself for the wave of hostility she expected. "I do," she said clearly, letting her voice ring out. "I have email threads that mention financial exchanges in return for property rezoning approvals. I have eyewitness accounts of suspicious briefcases handed off in parking garages after city council meetings." The moment she mentioned briefcases, there was an audible stir in the audience. Jaws tensed, eyes narrowed, and cameras flashed with renewed vigor. Even a few members of the press stood up, poised to better capture the drama. They knew a scandal when they heard one. Some watchers wore the expression of people who had suspected such events for years, but never had proof. Others looked appalled, almost personally insulted by the suggestion that their beloved institutions might be tainted. Alden opened his mouth, about to interrupt, but Councilman Monroe held up a hand, stopping him. It was a gesture of control, but behind her eyes was a flicker of alarm. "In that case, Miss Crockett," she said, voice trembling slightly despite her otherwise calm facade, "I trust that your claims will hold up under scrutiny. Because if they don't, you'll be facing legal consequences for slander." Her words crashed into the room, an open threat that hung in the stale air. Jasmine tightened her grip on the stand. She could see the battle lines forming around her. The hostility she sensed was not just directed at her, but at what she represented. An intrusion into the comfortable, carefully woven tapestry of power. The crowd held its breath. In that moment, it was as though the entire city paused, pinned on whether she would waver. She did not flinch. "I understand," she answered quietly, "and I will stand by every piece of evidence I have." There was something in her tone, an unshakable conviction, that made a few of the officials shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The hush lingered, and for a moment no one spoke. Then, from the far side of the table, a city attorney in a pinstripe suit cleared his throat. He introduced himself as Harold Northcott, pivoting the discussion to the procedural aspects of Jasmine's accusations. His words droned on about filing motions, about the formal steps she needed to take, about how the council would proceed with caution and dignity. She listened with a measured expression, acutely aware that his meticulous detailing of procedures was a tactic to drown her claims in bureaucracy. The city attorney's voice, smooth and even, contrasted with the tension swirling in the room. Meanwhile, from somewhere near the back, another subdued wave of laughter flickered again whenever her name was mentioned. The mockery tried to derail her composure, but each time she heard it, she steadied herself anew. She reminded herself that she was here by choice, compelled by the moral imperative that had haunted her for months. This was not about personal gain, it was about exposing the hidden gears of corruption. The debate was a stage, yes, but it was also a battlefield of truths against structured deflection. Alden, noticing that the conversation was drifting into technicalities, clasped his hands together and leaned into his microphone once more. "You keep referring to documents and testimonies," he said, a frosty edge to his tone, "but we've seen none of this yet. We can't very well indulge in sensational claims without evidence. Miss Crockett, do you actually have these files on you right now?" The question was a dagger aimed at her credibility. He knew the audience was hungry for concrete proof. The entire hall seemed to lean forward, waiting to see if she was bluffing. Jasmine inhaled, steeled her gaze on Alden, and nodded. She spoke in that same quiet, determined voice. "I have them," she said, "and I'm ready to share." The hush transformed into an expectant hush, thicker, more charged. Alden lifted a brow, his lips curving into a slight sneer. "Then by all means," he said, "drop 'em on the table. Let's see what you have, Ms. Crockett." She regarded him for a long moment, wanting to convey without words that she recognized this was yet another theatrical ploy. They believed she would present a neat folder, maybe an envelope or two. In short, they expected to see something they could quickly dismiss or challenge, something they could wave away with talk of verification. But she had come prepared for that. Slowly, she reached down to a bag at her feet, unzipped it, and withdrew a thin, neatly bound stack of papers. Then a second, then a third. Each stack was marked with colored tabs, signifying different categories: budget analyses, property records, testimony transcripts. The audience collectively leaned closer. The council members craned their necks, trying to gauge the thickness and authenticity of each file. As she placed them on the stand, she could see a flicker of unease flash across multiple faces. Perhaps they had not expected her to arrive with real, tangible documents. She had, after all, been laughed at just minutes ago for being late. Now the laughter was gone, replaced by a new tension. "I have dozens more just like these," Jasmine murmured, "and digital backups as well. It's all prepared, cross-referenced, and time-stamped." She allowed the words to settle. This was her first real push against their assumed power. A hush, even heavier than before, blanketed the room. The weight of the moment was immense. She could feel the eyes on her, sense the camera zooming in for close-ups. The city attorney's pen stopped scribbling. Councilwoman Monroe parted her lips slightly as though she wanted to speak but found her voice caught in her throat. Alden stared, narrowing his eyes. The prepared script he had mentally written for this confrontation was fracturing. Then someone in the press section let out a quiet exhale, likely a photographer capturing the drama in a series of shutters. The pause stretched on, the tension almost unbearable, until Alden cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the situation. "These are substantial," he said, carefully picking up the topmost stack. He flipped through a few pages, scanning them quickly. He pressed his lips together, as though trying to suppress any visible reaction. "We'll of course need time to verify the authenticity of these documents." Jasmine responded in an unwavering voice. "I understand. And I'm sure you will." A faint smile curled on her lips, not of amusement, but of a quiet, determined confidence. She had spent countless hours building the evidence, checking and cross-checking, preparing for exactly this moment. She knew what she held in her hands was real, and seeing their sudden discomfort stoked a quiet sense of vindication in her heart. She did not gloat, however. Instead, she braced herself because she knew this was only the opening salvo. Beyond the facade of a civil debate, she was challenging an entire structure that thrived on secrecy and the illusion of propriety. The truly difficult battle lay ahead, and she sensed that the city officials would do whatever it took to discredit her. The press seemed to sense a major story now. Hands shot up, flashlights glowed, and reporters shouted Jasmine's name, hoping to get her attention. She locked eyes with one of them, a young reporter in the front row. He wore a gray suit and had a determined set to his jaw, as though he too had come here chasing truth. He spoke up, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Crockett, is it true you were initially dismissed by local authorities when you first presented your concerns?" She nodded. "Yes. I was told to speak with multiple departments, none of which took any interest. For months I tried to bring this to the public's attention, but I was either ignored or waved away. That's why I'm here today, to make sure it can no longer be ignored." Councilwoman Monroe interrupted, aiming to wrest the conversation back into her control. "No one is ignoring serious claims. However, due process is required. If these allegations are proven false, the city won't hesitate to respond with legal recourse." The threat was repeated, louder this time, a last-ditch attempt to create an air of uncertainty around Jasmine's statements. She locked eyes with Monroe. "I welcome the scrutiny," she said softly. "In fact, I invite it, because I believe in what I've found." Behind her composed demeanor, her heart raced. She was aware that public perception was crucial. If the officials succeeded in painting her as just another conspiracy theorist, her evidence could be relegated to a footnote of unproven allegations. But if she maintained composure and provided meticulously gathered data, the city's mask of legitimacy could start to slip. Another wave of laughter tried to break the intensity. This time from a different side of the room, perhaps from supporters of the city council or from cynics who believed no real truth could come from a single citizen like her. Jasmine ignored it. She had expected ridicule. She had lived with it for weeks, from people who deemed her naive for daring to confront a well-oiled system of power. The real question, though, was how the council would react in the next phase of this confrontation. Once they realized the extent of what she had in that bombshell file. For now, she met every laugh, every sneer with an unwavering gaze, standing firm at the podium as though it were the last anchor of truth in a sea of political theater. She was not leaving, not until the final word was spoken, and beneath her calm exterior pulsed a righteous fire that no one in that room could easily extinguish. She thought back to the times she had second-guessed herself, the nights spent hunched over scattered documents, the fear that she was diving too deep into a labyrinth that could destroy her reputation, or worse. But those fears were behind her, replaced by a sense of moral clarity. She had come too far to be shaken now. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, faint but ominous, as if the city itself were stirring in anticipation of what might unfold. Inside, the tension remained near breaking point. The debate was far from over, and so was her fight. They had already laughed at her once. She could feel the weight of that mockery, and she could sense that more was coming. But that was the thing about laughter. It only had power if she let it seep into her convictions. And Jasmine Crockett was determined to show them that this was no joke. She would not wilt under pressure. She would do whatever it took to expose every detail she had uncovered. And if the city had secrets it wanted to keep hidden, well, she was prepared to drag them, one by one, into the unforgiving light. The laughter resurfaced yet again as the clock struck the next hour, this time sparked by a snide remark from a junior official on the far left. He leaned forward, his grin deliberate, enjoying the camera's attention. "Miss Crockett, do you think your late arrival perhaps undermines your credibility?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. There was that ripple of cheap laughter again, like a wave of mocking applause. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. She refused to let the tension break her composure, though she felt the flush of anger creeping along her spine. "I think," she said measuredly, "that the people in this city care more about truth and accountability than a few minutes on a clock." The smirk on his face faltered momentarily, replaced by a fleeting expression of annoyance. The official next to him hid a grin behind a hand, as though unwilling to openly show solidarity, but Jasmine saw it. She saw everything. Then, without missing a beat, the junior official spoke again. "You have a flair for drama, Ms. Crockett, I'll give you that. But I wonder, is this so-called evidence of yours actually going to stand up under expert analysis?" She let the question hang in the air, refusing to dignify it with an immediate response. It was a game, and she knew the rules. If she answered too fast, it would seem defensive. If she hesitated, they'd call her evasive. Instead, she took a breath, surveying the room. Several eyes shone with curiosity, others brimmed with skepticism. Yet, within that sea of faces, she spotted a handful that glimmered with silent hope. People who wanted her claims to be true because they'd lost faith in the city's official narrative. "That's for your experts to decide," she answered at last, her tone unwavering. "I'm prepared to put every piece of data I have under the microscope. But let's not forget, expert analysis can also be manipulated by those who pay for it. So I'd like independent oversight." The room erupted in murmurs. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others looked scandalized by the implication that official channels could be influenced. Alden shifted in his seat, not liking the direction this conversation was taking. "This debate is not the venue to impugn the integrity of recognized experts," he said tightly. "I suggest we keep the discussion on track." Jasmine bit back a retort, knowing that challenging them outright would only strengthen their claim that she was confrontational. She focused instead on the methodical layout of her documents, remembering the countless hours she'd spent verifying each line, each signature, and each timestamp. She recalled the shadowy corridors of City Hall, where she had snuck in to copy files from a neglected storeroom. The late-night phone calls to a frightened whistleblower who almost backed out at the last minute. All of that was culminating here, in this cauldron of tension. So let them scoff, let them question. Facts had a way of enduring even when people tried to bury them. "If I may," came a voice from the side belonging to a different council member, Chase Hamilton. He looked younger than the rest, with an earnestness in his eyes that suggested he was either new to the game or was still clinging to idealism. "I think it would be prudent to at least examine Ms. Crockett's main points. She clearly has put significant effort into collecting evidence, and while none of us want to see the city tarnished by unproven allegations, we also shouldn't dismiss the possibility that there's merit to her claims." Alden shot Hamilton a warning look, but Hamilton pressed on anyway, his hands clasped on the table. "We convened this debate to allow Ms. Crockett a platform, so let's hear her out properly. Let's give her a chance to state the core of her argument before we drag her through the mud." Jasmine felt a flicker of gratitude. Though she didn't know Hamilton personally, she recognized sincerity when she heard it. The tension in the room shifted slightly, as though a small breach in the dam of hostility had formed, allowing a trickle of rational discourse. Alden adjusted his tie and took a moment to respond. "Very well," he said, almost curtly. "Ms. Crockett, you have 5 minutes to lay out your main allegations, but do keep in mind that your time is limited." The restriction was typical. Give her just enough rope to speak, but not enough to elaborate thoroughly. She took a steadying breath and began, voice calm but charged with the weight of what she was about to reveal. She outlined the connections she had discovered between city officials and real estate developers, the suspicious funneling of large sums into off-the-books accounts, the delayed release of public records that, had they been disclosed on time, might have alerted citizens to questionable zoning changes. She cited document codes, dates, and names. She didn't read off everything verbatim, that would have taken hours, but she skillfully summarized the most incriminating points, the cornerstones of her accusations. The hush in the hall grew more profound as each detail landed, like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of disbelief and alarm. Cameras flashed incessantly now, capturing her expression, the lines of determination etched on her face. She ended her allotted time by saying, "I'm not here to cause chaos or tarnish reputations unjustly. I'm here because the people of this city deserve transparency and accountability. If my evidence is false, disprove it. But if it's real, and I believe it is, then it points to a serious breach of public trust." Her last words echoed, and for an instant, no one moved. Even the laughter had died completely. She could sense the shift in energy. Some people looked disturbed, others thoughtful, and a few members of the council seemed downright apprehensive. Only Alden wore that same tight-lipped expression, as though holding back a deeper reaction. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Your time is up," he said, almost snapping. Then, trying to soften the abruptness, he added, "We'll certainly follow up on these points, but let me remind everyone that allegations do not equal guilt. The city's due process will not be compromised by mere spectacle. With that pronouncement, he brought down a small gavel on the table, signaling a recess. A wave of chatter filled the space as soon as the sharp rap ceased. Reporters rushed forward, brandishing microphones and phones. Spectators whispered among themselves, some glancing at Jasmine with newfound respect, others eyeing her with disdain. Officials huddled among themselves at the table, discussing the best angle to spin the situation. The undercurrent of tension still throbbed, but now it carried a note of uncertainty. They had expected to easily discredit her. Instead, she had shown up with organized files, cross-referenced data, and an unflappable demeanor. It was clear she was no easy target. Jasmine stood there, letting the noise wash over her, aware that she had crossed the first barrier. She was no longer just the woman laughed at for being late. She had demanded attention, forced them to see her as a credible voice. But she knew the real trials were just beginning. During the recess, a few reporters approached her, peppering her with questions. She answered a handful politely but quickly excused herself to find a corner of the hall where she could gather her thoughts. The debate was in recess, not over. Soon she would be called back, likely confronted by city lawyers armed with rhetorical traps and the authorities' collective might. She scrolled through her phone, confirming that she had backups of everything. A sense of relief washed over her. The digital copies were safely stored in multiple secure locations. Still, her nerves were far from settled. She glanced around. The once laughing corner had grown quiet. A few of those who had mocked her earlier were now pacing anxiously, checking their phones, as though bracing for a bombshell headline. She felt a twinge of satisfaction at the shift in atmosphere, but she also felt the weight of knowing that victory was not guaranteed. Corruption, once cornered, could lash out viciously. She cast a quick look at the dais where Alden stood speaking quietly with Monroe and the city attorney. They seemed tense, their discussion punctuated by quick glances in her direction. Whatever they were planning, she would not be caught unaware. With a final deep breath, she steeled herself for what would come next. She had delivered her opening salvo, yes, but the next stage, where she would be interrogated, possibly belittled, was approaching. She clutched a small flash drive in her pocket, a symbol of her determination. If they thought the stacks of paper she brought were everything, they were mistaken. What was on this flash drive could turn the entire debate on its head, but she would reveal it only at the perfect moment, when their laughter returned and their attempts to discredit her reached a peak. Then she would drop the file that, in her mind, sealed this city's fate. The recess would end soon, the moderator would reconvene the hearing, the cameras would roll again, and the battle would resume. For now, she embraced the quiet corner, letting her pulse slow to a steady thrum. She reminded herself why she was here. For the countless citizens who had no voice. For the whistleblowers who lived in fear. For every person told that their concerns were invalid. She was not just fighting for herself. That knowledge made her strong, even as the weight of the entire institution pressed down on her shoulders. She closed her eyes, remembering the hours spent in pursuit of a single piece of paper, the nights with minimal sleep, the reams of data cross-checked under flickering lamplight, and she remembered the humiliating snickers from the very officials who were now forced to listen to her. The laughter would not define her. The truth would, and she had come prepared to wage war with it. When the recess ended, Alden called the session back to order with the crisp strike of his gavel. The chatter quickly died, replaced by a charged expectancy. Even the air felt heavier, as though the collective tension had reached a dangerous concentration. City council members reclaimed their seats with stern expressions, each presumably briefed on the approach they'd take to dismantle Jasmine's claims. She walked back to the podium, bracing herself for a renewed onslaught of pointed questions. First, though, Alden spoke. Before we continue, I'd like to remind everyone that this forum is meant for orderly discussion. We will not entertain disruptions or grandstanding. Is that clear? He let his gaze sweep the room, as if he were a judge scanning a restless jury. Jasmine's gaze flicked to the cluster of officials. A wave of subdued nods signaled everyone understood the rules. She shifted her focus back to Alden, who now appeared eager to tighten the reins on her narrative. All right. Crockett, he said, you mentioned earlier that part of your evidence includes testimonies from unnamed witnesses. We have serious concerns about the reliability of statements made by individuals who refuse to be identified. Can you clarify why these witnesses haven't come forward publicly? His words were a subtle attempt to cast doubt on the credibility of her evidence. She had anticipated this angle. They're afraid of retaliation, she said clearly. They believe certain officials have the means to silence them, either through job loss or legal intimidation. That's why their identities are protected. For now. A scoff echoed from somewhere near the dais, from one of the officials who had been leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. Protected? He repeated sarcastically. Convenient, don't you think? She ignored the barb. It's unfortunate that we live in a climate where whistleblowers must fear for their safety, but I'd argue that's further proof of the city's hostile environment when it comes to exposing corruption. Councilwoman Monroe spoke next, her gaze steady. We understand the concept of whistleblower protection, Ms. Crockett, but you must realize how difficult it is for us to accept the validity of claims from anonymous sources. Anyone can say anything if they're shielded from accountability. Jasmine let the councilwoman's words linger, then she replied, "They have provided notarized statements, each with supporting documentation. Their anonymity doesn't prevent me from verifying the timestamps, the paper trails, or the context in which they worked. The important details are verifiable, regardless of whether their identities are public." A hush followed, broken only by the scratch of pens and the distant click of cameras. She could see on their faces that they understood the significance of her approach. She was no amateur. She had done her homework. With a slight shift in his seat, Alden addressed her once again, this time in a lower, more controlled voice. "You're painting a picture of widespread wrongdoing. Doesn't it strike you as implausible that so many officials across various departments would conspire together, all without a single leak or confession until you came along?" The challenge hung in the air, a pointed attempt to isolate her as the lone voice crying wolf. She inhaled and paused, scanning the room before she responded. The watchers, the reporters, even some of the city employees seemed riveted. "It's not a matter of one grand conspiracy," she explained. "It's a series of overlapping interests. Each official might only see their corner of the puzzle. A minor favor here, a refiled document there, a small but consistent perk, a meeting that runs just long enough for a handshake in private. When you trace the money and the property deals, you start to see the bigger picture. It's not that they all conspired openly like in some novel, it's that they each benefited in small hidden ways, which amounted to a systemic breach of public trust." She paused, letting her words settle. "Secrecy thrives in pieces, not as a monolith. That's why it took so long for anyone to connect the dots." The sincerity and clarity of her explanation cast a hush that even Alden couldn't immediately break. A flicker of unease passed over his face, as though he recognized that her logic was difficult to refute outright. Still, he managed a curt nod. "I see," he said, flipping through his notes. "Well, Miss Crockett, if you're suggesting a systemic issue, then I presume you have specific names attached to each questionable transaction. Care to share some of them for the record?" Another trap. The moment she started naming names publicly, she could open herself to immediate lawsuits for defamation, unless the evidence was airtight. She felt a chill. She did have names, carefully documented. But she also knew the fury that would erupt if she exposed them all in one go, especially before the evidence had been formally reviewed. Yet there was a part of her that longed to do it, to fling open the shutters and let the sunlight scorch every shadowy corner. This was her chance to demonstrate that she wasn't bluffing. She met Alden's gaze, her pulse quickening. "I'm prepared to release specific names," she said, enunciating each word so there could be no mistake. "But I want assurances that an independent investigative body, not just the City Council's internal committee, will be involved." The statement caused a stir, a wave of murmurs that spread through the audience like ripples in water. A reporter in the back exclaimed, "Why independent, Miss Crockett? Are you saying the council can't be trusted to investigate itself?" Alden's face tightened. He tapped his microphone, sending out a short burst of static. "Order, please," he commanded. Then he turned to Jasmine. "You're implying we have a conflict of interest?" Jasmine kept her voice measured but resolute. "I'm suggesting that anybody investigating its own members could be influenced, consciously or subconsciously, to protect them. That's why external oversight is crucial." If nothing is amiss, an independent review will confirm it. But if something is wrong, we need assurance that the findings won't be buried. A faint rustle of support flickered through some corners of the audience, but it was quickly hushed by stern glances from officials who recognized the danger in her words. She was calling for external eyes, outside the local power structure. For them, that was akin to throwing open the city's locked doors for everyone to scrutinize. Councilwoman Monroe pursed her lips, pressing her fingers together on the table. "We'll take your request under consideration," she said, clearly displeased. "But for now, please understand that this city has its own oversight channels. Our ethics committee, our legal counsel. We have processes in place for such matters." "Processes that have failed so far," Jasmine said quietly but firmly. She let her voice rest there, not raising it but making sure it was heard. The tension in the hall was near palpable. No more laughter came. Even the corners that had mocked her earlier sat in silence, drawn into the gravity of the confrontation unfolding on the dais. She could see in Alden's rigid posture and Monroe's clenched jaw that they were desperate to regain control of the narrative, to relegate her allegations to mere rumors. But she kept adding layers to her argument. She felt her confidence growing even as a sense of danger lurked. She was pushing them. Sooner or later, they would push back harder. The city attorney, Harold Northcott, cleared his throat, stepping into the fray again. "Ms. Crockett, you mentioned email threads regarding financial exchanges. Could you specify how you obtained these emails? If they were leaked without proper authorization, they might not even be admissible in certain forums." That was a classic tactic, questioning the legality of how she got the evidence, implying it might be invalid. Jasmine expected it. "These emails came from employees who had authorized access," she explained calmly. "They shared them with me because they believed the public had a right to know. The question of admissibility is one for the courts, but ethically, I think transparency about potential corruption outweighs the secrecy that might protect it." A hush followed her words, as if the entire room collectively inhaled. She was speaking truths that threatened the established order. She could feel it. She also sensed a looming confrontation. Alden's frustration began to show. He drummed his fingers on the table, then finally addressed her with a thin veneer of civility. "You have quite the flair for making accusations, Ms. Crockett, but until your claims are verified, I suggest caution. Throwing around terms like systemic corruption can irreparably damage public trust if, in fact, this city is not guilty, as you say." Jasmine heard the subtle menace in his voice. "Damaging public trust is a two-way street," she replied softly. "If the city is clean, my claims will fall apart under scrutiny. But if it isn't, then the city has been lying to its people for a very long time. That damage is on them, not on the whistleblowers." She watched him carefully, seeing how his jaw clenched, his brow furrowed. He appeared to search for the right retort, but the tense silence allowed her words to stand. A wave of camera shutters clicked, capturing the standoff. Councilwoman Monroe leaned into her microphone, using a professional calm that almost sounded like it was carved from ice. "Croc, let's be clear, we are not on trial here. You are the one making serious allegations. You have brought your stack of documents. We will review them. We will investigate as necessary. But do not mistake our due process for stonewalling." Jasmine nearly smiled at the choice of words. "I appreciate due process. I just want to ensure it's not used as a shield to deflect legitimate scrutiny." The crowd murmured again, a faint rumble of approval from some, discomfort from others. She felt the dynamic shifting, as though the entire hall was gradually coming to realize that this was more than a fleeting spectacle. Something deeper was unraveling. Perhaps that's why no one had laughed for the last several minutes. The initial mockery had evaporated, replaced by tension. Sensing that the room was at a tipping point, Alden attempted to pivot. He pulled out a sheet of paper, glancing at it briefly, then faced the room. "In light of these extraordinary claims, the council will move to form a preliminary inquiry, will designate a committee to review Ms. Crockett's documents in conjunction with the city's legal advisors and determine the next steps. This is the proper channel for such matters." He banged the gavel once more, as if that closed the discussion, but Jasmine wasn't done. She didn't wait for them to dismiss her. Instead, she took a step forward. I have one more piece of evidence to share, she said, voice resonating in the sudden hush. Everyone froze. Alden hesitated, an irritated flicker crossing his features. We're not accepting additional evidence at this moment. The recess has concluded and… It's relevant, Jasmine interjected, controlling her volume so it didn't sound like she was shouting over him. It's a file that directly implicates a key figure in city government in a real estate deal that would shock the entire city. She slid her hand into her pocket, producing the small flash drive, its metallic surface gleaming under the overhead lights. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Reporters stood on tiptoe, angling for a better view. The city council members glanced at one another in alarm. The tension soared to a new height. On this drive, Jasmine continued, are phone call recordings, email transcripts, and signed documents relating to the exchange of property near the waterfront. The property was rezoned quietly, with falsified records claiming it was vacant land. In reality, it housed low-income families who were displaced without notice. The official who signed off on the rezoning, he sits on this very council. That last line struck the assembly like a thunderbolt. Gasps mingled with frantic camera shutters. Even Councilwoman Monroe looked unsettled, though she tried to maintain composure. Alden's face was now ashen, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Miss Crockett, he said, struggling to remain composed, this is not how we handle evidence. There is a process. A process that's already been compromised? Jasmine challenged. Those families were forced out in the dead of night. The developer moved in, bulldozed the property, and it's now slated for luxury condos. Permits were expedited, bypassing standard city protocols. I have all of it right here. She held the flash drive up higher, letting the cameras capture it. A cacophony of voices erupted, reporters shouting for details, council members objecting to the spectacle, some members of the audience exclaiming in dismay. It was as if a dam had broken, and the swirling tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface now flooded the hall in one unstoppable rush. Alden slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the din. Order! We will have order in this chamber! Gradually, the clamor subsided, though the air crackled with barely contained energy. Several officials looked pale, glancing anxiously at one another. In that moment, the smirks and sneers of earlier seemed like remnants of a naive past. Now, they faced the possibility that their carefully curated image was about to collapse. Miss Crockett, Alden said once more, forcing an even tone, we will review whatever file you have, but I must caution you again that making baseless, sensational claims can land you in serious legal jeopardy. His words carried a flicker of desperation, as though he hoped the threat of lawsuits would muzzle her. She met his gaze without wavering. I'm prepared for whatever may come, Mr. Carraway, she said. These aren't baseless claims. They're verifiable records. If I'm lying, let the evidence prove me wrong. If I'm telling the truth… She trailed off, letting the implication land. And it did. The hush returned, more potent than ever. No one rushed to fill the silence. The gravity of the moment was undeniable. For a second, Jasmine thought she saw genuine fear in Alden's eyes. Fear of what might happen if the truths buried in that flash drive were laid bare for all to see. Councilwoman Monroe silently rose from her seat, casting a quick glance at the city attorney, who gave a subtle nod. She then spoke, her voice strained, but maintaining a veneer of professionalism. We will hold an emergency closed session meeting to address this new information, she announced. At that time, Ms. Crockett, you will hand over the flash drive to our legal counsel. We will not be conducting a trial by public opinion here. The statement was as close to a concession as Jasmine would get for the moment. She nodded, realizing that for now the formalities had to be observed. But she also knew that the media had caught every word, every gesture. They'd run with the story. Jasmine Crockett produces Bombshell file at debate. The press conference had effectively become a battlefield, and she had delivered a decisive blow. Still, the fight was far from over. The system would use all its might to protect itself. Yet she felt a surge of validation. This was the moment she had prepared for. The unveiling of evidence so damning that they couldn't just laugh it off. As the commotion died down, Alden signaled to adjourn the debate, his hands trembling slightly as he grasped the gavel for the final strike. The meeting ended, but the tension did not fade. People rose from their seats, their voices hushed or agitated, forming clusters to discuss what they'd just witnessed. Officials rapidly packed their materials, some glaring at Jasmine, others avoiding her gaze entirely. A handful of them hurried out a side door, presumably to strategize about damage control. The press scrambled to gather quotes, chasing after any official they could corner. In the midst of the swirling crowd, Jasmine stood near the podium, the flash drive safely in her hand, uncertain if it was wise to let it out of her possession. She caught sight of a small knot of bystanders in the corner, working-class people from the look of them who wore expressions of wary hope. One woman offered a small nod of appreciation. Another clasped his hands in silent applause. Jasmine felt an unexpected wave of emotion. She had carried the weight of this struggle for so long, not fully aware of how many people needed her to succeed. She acknowledged them with a respectful tilt of her head. Then she took a slow, deliberate step away from the dais, weaving through the throng. Microphones bobbed in front of her face and voices shouted her name, but she politely declined further comment for now. She needed a moment to breathe, to reflect on what had just transpired. Reaching the back door, she slipped outside into the corridor, heart thundering in her chest. She glanced down at the flash drive again, its surface reflecting the faint fluorescent lights overhead. This tiny object contained the power to topple careers, to uproot families of influence, to expose everything. She had just detonated the first charge by revealing its existence. They could call her dramatic, rebellious, or naive, but she knew the truth. And she vowed to see it through. Drawing a long, steady breath, she pressed the flash drive against her heart for a moment, then tucked it safely into her bag. She could still hear the cacophony of voices from the debate hall, the rushed footsteps of officials scurrying to salvage their reputations. She was certain that powerful people were already plotting ways to discredit or intimidate her. It wouldn't surprise her if they resorted to slander or even more sinister means. But the evidence was out. The truth was a living thing now, unstoppable in its march forward. She walked away from the chaos and down the long corridor, determined not to let fear overshadow her resolve. With each step, she recalled the echo of their laughter from earlier, the mocking sound that had greeted her when she arrived late. How quickly it had vanished once she dropped the bombshell. In that fleeting transformation, she found fuel for her spirit. They had tried to drown her in humiliation. Instead, she forced them to reckon with the facts. As she neared the building's exit, the crisp afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass doors. She paused, letting the warmth wash over her face. The world outside continued to spin, oblivious to the drama inside City Hall. Cars passed, people chattered on sidewalks, and life went on. But in that debate chamber, something had cracked. The old veneer of unassailable authority was peeling away. She whispered quietly to herself, "This is only the beginning." Then, head held high, she pushed the door open and stepped out into the light, carrying 1,000 pages of documents, a single flash drive, and a will unbroken by scorn or threat. What lay ahead would test her convictions like never before, but she felt a fierce calm. Her story was now in motion, and the city, whether it liked it or not, would have to face the truths she held in her hands. The debate was over, but the real struggle had just begun. Days later, Jasmine found herself summoned back to City Hall, this time for the closed session meeting Councilwoman Monroe had promised. The building looked the same, imposing arches, tall pillars, the city's emblem etched above the entrance. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. Reporters milled about outside with cameras and microphones, waiting to pounce on any updates. She walked past them without stopping, her heart pounding, the weight of the flash drive pressed against her bag's lining. Inside, the corridor leading to the meeting room was hushed. A few city employees offered her polite nods, but no one spoke. The air felt stale, as though the entire place were holding its breath. She reached a set of polished wooden doors guarded by two stern-faced officials who checked her name on a list. They opened the doors, and she stepped into a smaller chamber. No spectators, no general public, just a handful of city council members, the city attorney, and a couple of legal aides. Alden was there, of course, perched at the center of a long table like a judge presiding over a secret hearing. Councilwoman Monroe was at his right. Chase Hamilton, the younger council member who had shown her some fairness, sat near the end, looking uneasy. She couldn't tell if he was on her side or just overwhelmed by the political fallout. "Good afternoon, Miss Crockett," Alden said, his face expressionless. The usual theatrics were absent, replaced by a tension that felt almost tangible. "We trust you understand this session is confidential. No recording devices, no public statements without our joint approval." She nodded, placing her phone and other electronics on a small table by the door as requested. Then she moved to the seat they had arranged for her, facing the council. Her eyes swept the room, lingering on each person present. She recognized a few from the earlier debate, the ones who had mocked or stared her down, though now they wore forced neutrality, as if trying to appear calm. "Ms. Crockett," Councilwoman Rowe began, "we've convened to examine the new evidence you introduced, specifically the digital records relating to property rezoning and illegal displacement. You said you'd supply them to our legal counsel." Jasmine unclasped her bag, withdrew the flash drive, and held it out. The city attorney Northcott stood up, walking over to retrieve it. He returned to his seat, inserted the drive into a laptop, and began to sift through the files. Tense silence reigned. Meanwhile, Alden kept his gaze fixed on Jasmine. She could almost feel the irritation radiating off him. If it were up to him, she suspected, he would have barred her from setting foot in City Hall. But public outcry had forced their hand. At length, Northcott spoke, his tone cautious. "I see multiple folders, email threads, phone logs, property documents. And then there's an audio folder. For clarity, Ms. Crockett, how did you obtain these recordings?" Her reply was measured. "They were provided by an individual who worked as an administrative assistant for a real estate developer involved in these transactions. The phone logs were automatically archived, and the developer frequently recorded calls as a form of internal record keeping." Northcott exchanged a quick look with Alden. "These might have been obtained without explicit consent," he said, arching a brow, "which complicates." "They belong to the developer," Jasmine cut in, "and the assistant had access. If the developer wants to claim a privacy violation, that's up to them. But as far as I'm concerned, these logs confirm a pattern of misconduct that affects public interests." She refused to let them reduce the discussion to procedural quibbling. The room fell silent again. She noticed Councilwoman Monroe tapping a pen against the tabletop, a nervous tick. Chase Hamilton leaned forward, eyes fixed on the laptop screen. Eventually, Northcott clicked on an audio file. A muffled conversation emanated from the speakers. The voices slightly distorted. A man's voice was dictating instructions about moving families out discreetly and making sure the rezoning passes without fuss. Another voice responded, "We'll handle it. We'll get approval from the guy on the council who signs off." The city attorney paused the recording, exhaling sharply. "We'll need to verify these voices, obviously." Jasmine nodded, her pulse racing. This was it. The moment the city's shield of denial might crack further. She studied the council members' faces. Some looked horrified, some stunned. Alden's face was inscrutable, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. Councilwoman Monroe cleared her throat. "And you claim you have documentation tying these references to actual council action?" Jasmine opened her bag again, pulling out a binder. "Cross-referenced by date and city council minutes. Approval signatures line up exactly with the time frame of these calls. Here." She handed the binder to a legal aide who passed it along to the council members. Silence descended again as pages were flipped, eyes scanning columns of data. The only sound was the soft whir of the air conditioning unit. At one point, Chase Hamilton muttered, "This is thorough," under his breath, earning a cold glance from Alden. Slowly, meticulously, the council members reviewed the materials. Jasmine waited, her heart pounding louder with each passing second. Finally, Alden leaned back in his chair. His voice, when it came, was quiet but laced with tension. "This is very serious. I assume you understand the implications." "I do," Jasmine replied calmly. "And so should you." His jaw tensed. "We'll conduct a formal investigation, obviously, but these documents and recordings, if verified, could result in criminal charges for multiple individuals." She detected a slight tremor in his voice, and she wondered if he was thinking about colleagues or friends who might be implicated. "That's why an independent body is essential," she reiterated. "If the investigation remains within city jurisdiction, I fear it could be tampered with. The developers involved wield significant influence here." Councilwoman Monroe pressed her lips together. "We understand your perspective, Ms. Crockett. But the city's investigative mechanisms are robust. Bringing in external agencies might cause further public mistrust and media frenzy. Jasmine frowned. Is that what concerns you? Media frenzy? Or uncovering the actual truth? A hush fell, thick and suffocating. She knew she was treading a dangerous line, calling them out so directly, but the stakes were too high for half measures. They could talk all day about procedural integrity while quietly sweeping things under the rug. She wouldn't allow that. Northcott broke the silence, folding his hands on the table. We will refer this to the State Attorney General's office. Given the scope of the allegations and potential criminal liability, they'll decide if a broader investigation is warranted. Jasmine felt a quiet relief flicker in her chest. It wasn't a promise of justice, but it was a step. The state level was at least somewhat more removed from local pressures. She nodded in agreement, then Alden spoke again, voice forcibly even. Until the investigation concludes, I suggest we all refrain from public statements. That includes you, Ms. Crockett. The city doesn't need a trial by media, and we can't have you releasing partial information that might inflame tensions. His gaze bore into her, carrying an unspoken warning. She hesitated. A gag order? That was exactly the kind of silence they wanted to impose. But if she refused, they could claim she was undermining the investigation. If she agreed, they could operate without public scrutiny. She weighed her options. Finally, she said, I won't jeopardize a legitimate investigation, but I won't be bullied into silence. If I see any sign of a cover-up, I'll go straight to the press again. The tension in the room spiked. She could sense Alden fighting the urge to lash out at her. Councilwoman Monroe carefully set her pen down, as though controlling her every motion. Let's proceed responsibly, she said, trying to moderate the moment. That goes for everyone in this room. We'll do our due diligence and let the investigative authorities do theirs. A subdued round of assent followed. They all recognized that the conversation had reached a precarious climax. Jasmine had effectively forced them to bring in the State Attorney General's office, escalating the situation far beyond local politics. As the meeting concluded, she could tell the council members were already strategizing. A swirl of tension followed her out of the room. The flash drive remained with the city attorney, who would forward it to the appropriate investigative units. She had backups, of course, safely secured, in case anything mysteriously disappeared. Emerging into the corridor, she found it noticeably emptier than before. No throng of staffers, no line of citizens seeking permits, just a quiet hush in the vast hallway, almost like a mausoleum. She strode through, her footsteps echoing. Outside, the bright sunlight caught her by surprise, momentarily blinding her. Reporters rushed forward, but she merely shook her head, indicating she wouldn't speak. She slipped past them, the weight of the city's future resting heavily on her shoulders. In the following days, a tsunami of speculation hit the local news outlets. Leaked tidbits from City Hall suggested that multiple council members were implicated. Whispers of bribery, undisclosed side deals, and displacement of vulnerable communities swirled in online forums. Jasmine became both a figure of admiration and scorn. Supporters praised her bravery while critics labeled her a grandstander hungry for media attention. She tried to ignore both extremes, focusing on the mission to ensure the evidence was not buried and accountability was served. She received anonymous threats, letters slipped under her door, phone calls in the dead of night from masked numbers warning her to back off. At first, they rattled her. Fear gripped her heart, and she questioned whether she had enough personal protection if push came to shove. But as the nights wore on, that fear hardened into resolve. She began documenting every threat, every suspicious incident, building yet another file. If they wanted to intimidate her, she would make sure the record of it existed. No more secrets. No more shadows. Rumors circulated that Alden and other high-ranking officials were scrambling to isolate the scandal. They tried to paint the situation as the result of one or two bad apples, but the more the press uncovered, the more it seemed an entire orchard might be rotten. Meanwhile, the displacement story exploded. Families who'd been forced out of their homes came forward with harrowing accounts: nighttime evictions, unannounced demolitions, personal belongings crushed under bulldozers. One mother tearfully described how she and her children had to sleep in a relative's living room for weeks because they had nowhere else to go. Public outrage soared. The city council tried damage control, promising to provide temporary housing assistance. But it was too little, too late. Every band-aid they tried to place on the wound was ripped away by new revelations. Through it all, Jasmine maintained a deliberate silence regarding the specifics of her evidence, honoring her agreement to let the formal investigation unfold. Yet she stood ready. Her phone buzzed constantly with requests for interviews from national outlets, turning her into a reluctant hero for some, a villain for others. She refused to be drawn into the spotlight just to feed the media cycle. This wasn't about personal glory, it was about justice, plain and simple. Weeks passed, and the tension in the city only grew. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, demanding resignations, chanting slogans about transparency and truth. Banners with Jasmine's name appeared, though she cringed at the hero worship. It wasn't about her. It was about exposing a system that had failed its people. Late one evening, she sat in her small apartment, surrounded by documents and files, the quiet hum of the city outside her window. A single lamp illuminated her workspace. She felt the exhaustion creeping in, the weight of it all threatening to overwhelm her. She wondered if any of this would truly lead to lasting change, or if the system would simply adapt, reshuffle its players, and carry on. She closed her eyes, recalling the echoes of laughter that had first greeted her in that debate hall. She remembered how quickly that laughter vanished when she laid out the truth. That's the power of evidence, she reminded herself. She didn't need them to believe in her. She just needed the facts to speak so loudly they couldn't be denied. Tomorrow, the state attorney general's office was expected to release a preliminary statement about the scope of their investigation. It could vindicate her, or it could claim insufficient grounds to proceed further. She had no illusions about the complexities of politics. But she also knew she had done everything in her power to ensure the truth saw the light of day. Outside, a siren blared, followed by the rumble of late-night traffic. She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting over the scattered papers that had once been her secret project, her burden. Now they were the city's burden, the seeds of a reckoning. Whatever the future held, she could take solace in one fact. She had faced their laughter, their mockery, and she had not wavered. No matter how this ended, she had made them see that an ordinary woman with documents could stand up to institutional power and not back down. She could almost hear the echo of that laughter, but in her mind it was drowned out by the steady drumbeat of truth, an unstoppable march. And in that quiet moment, she allowed herself a small, weary smile, resolved to see this through, no matter what price she had to pay. Morning arrived with a dull gray sky and a promise of rain. Jasmine walked down to the local coffee shop where the television above the counter was tuned to a news channel. People were gathered, necks craned upward, waiting for the Attorney General's announcement. She ordered a coffee, her stomach churning. She glanced at the screen just in time to see the anchor switch to a live feed from the state capitol. A serious-looking official with a neatly trimmed beard stood at a podium, flashing cameras capturing every blink. After reviewing the evidence submitted, as well as preliminary testimony and corroborating documents from various sources, he said in a measured tone, "Our office has found sufficient grounds to launch a formal investigation into the allegations of corruption, property mismanagement, and potential bribery within the city council of..." He named Jasmine's city, and the coffee shop erupted in a flurry of murmurs. Jasmine's heart pounded. She found a seat, carefully placing her coffee down so her trembling hands wouldn't spill it. The official continued, "We have reason to believe that certain high-ranking officials may have used their positions to facilitate illegal rezoning measures, resulting in the displacement of families and the transfer of property under false pretenses. We will be working closely with federal agencies to ensure an impartial and thorough investigation." A hush fell over the cafe's patrons. It was real. An official probe, validated by the state. This was no longer just her word against the cities. It was happening. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The newscast cut to a reporter who talked about possible indictments and the public's outrage. Jasmine took a sip of coffee, her hands still shaky. The watchers around her whispered in amazement. A few recognized her, darting glances in her direction, but she pretended not to notice. She finished her drink and slipped out into the grisly morning. Rain spattered on the pavement, and she stood under the shop's awning for a moment, exhaling deeply. Her city was about to undergo a reckoning. Within hours, social media lit up. City corruption trended, fueled by the official announcement. National outlets picked up the story, recounting how an unassuming woman named Jasmine Crockett had blown the whistle on an entrenched system of graft. She received more calls, more interview requests, but she also received more threats, subtle and direct. "You'd better watch your back," one voice hissed through her phone late at night. Another time, she found her car window smashed in. She filed police reports, but her hopes for genuine protection were low. Still, she refused to cower. In the midst of the chaos, Alden, Councilwoman Monroe, and others tried to present a unified front, insisting they welcomed the investigation, claiming they were confident no wrongdoing would be found. But as the days passed, leaks suggested that some council members were already considering resigning. The rumor mill churned out tales of backroom deals, hush money, and frantic attempts to strike immunity agreements. Jasmine kept her head low, but her eyes open. She realized that any single event, a misstep, a malicious rumor, could turn the tide. She needed to maintain her credibility and remain vigilant. One afternoon, she was summoned again, this time to the State Attorney General's regional office. She sat in a minimalist waiting area, the steady click of a clock marking each second. Eventually, a lean man in a crisp suit appeared, introducing himself as Michael Brandt, the lead investigator. He guided her down a hallway to a small, unassuming conference room. Inside waited two other investigators and a stack of files. "We appreciate your cooperation, Miss Crockett," Brandt said, offering a brief smile. "We need to verify certain aspects of your evidence, particularly the phone recordings and how you connected them to council actions." Over the next few hours, she painstakingly explained her methods, her sources, and her cross-referencing. She recounted how she'd discovered the forged signatures on rezoning forms, how certain emails matched the voices discussing under-the-table transactions. She also provided more details on the displaced families, giving names of individuals who might be willing to testify now that an official probe was underway. The investigators listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting to see relevant documents again. She found them professional, detail-oriented, and refreshingly free of the condescending airs she'd encountered among city officials. By the end of the session, they appeared genuinely appreciative of her efforts. "Your documentation is remarkably thorough," Brandt commented, closing a file. "We haven't encountered many whistleblowers who come this prepared." She managed a faint smile. "I've been preparing for a long time." "Well, we'll be in touch," he said, rising to shake her hand. "We anticipate calling you back for further statements, possibly a grand jury hearing if this escalates." The mention of a grand jury made her stomach flip, but she nodded, determined not to let her nerves betray her. She left the office feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation. The weight of the investigation was enormous, but at least it was in capable hands. The city's secrets were unraveling one thread at a time, and she had front-row seats to the unraveling. Over the following weeks, the city hall that once exuded arrogance now seemed like a fortress under siege. Multiple council members hired high-profile defense attorneys. A swirl of subpoenas and closed-door depositions took place. Local news outlets camped outside the courthouse, capturing each stoic expression of officials entering and exiting under a cloud of suspicion. Alden, in particular, appeared on the news more frequently, insisting on his innocence and condemning unsubstantiated attacks. Yet viewers noted how his eyes darted whenever reporters asked about the phone calls that referenced council approval in exchange for payouts. Pressure mounted on him to answer direct questions, but he pivoted to standard lines about the legal process. Meanwhile, Councilwoman Monroe maintained a measured stance, expressing confidence in the city's integrity. But no amount of carefully worded statements could stop the growing dissatisfaction among citizens who felt betrayed. Protests swelled, calling for immediate resignations of anyone linked to the scandal. One morning, Jasmine awoke to a message from an anonymous tipster claiming to have documents implicating Alden directly in a bribery scheme. She weighed the risks of meeting this person, suspecting it could be a trap. In the end, she forwarded the tip to the state investigators. She had to trust them. This was bigger than her or any single individual. She wouldn't turn vigilante. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. Had Alden been personally profiting from the corruption, or was he just complicit by looking the other way? Each day brought fresh revelations. The city's top building inspector resigned suddenly, citing personal health reasons. Whispers abounded that he'd accepted hush money to pass unsafe developments. A local businessman stepped forward, admitting he'd paid bribes to expedite permits, naming names of who facilitated the deals. The entire structure was collapsing. Yet for all the grim details, Jasmine felt a certain fierce pride. She remembered the laughter in that debate hall. They had mocked her for being late, for daring to challenge them. Now the truth had grown too large to contain. She was no saint. She had only stumbled upon the first thread and pulled, discovering a tapestry of corruption. But in doing so, she had given her city a chance to reclaim its conscience. One evening, she flipped through channels and paused on a local news broadcast, featuring a mother with tear-streaked cheeks. The woman described how her family's home was bulldozed without warning. Her children lost all their toys and books. They were forced into a cramped motel room for months. She spoke directly into the camera, thanking Jasmine Crockett for standing up to the city. That moment nearly broke. Tears welled in her eyes. She had embarked on this crusade for exactly that reason, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She wiped her cheeks and resolved to continue, no matter how many threats came her way. The final showdown arrived on a day of unrelenting rain. Dark clouds hovered over the city, as though nature herself was heralding a storm within City Hall. The Attorney General's office had concluded its preliminary investigation, and a press conference was scheduled in front of the courthouse. Jasmine stood in the crowd, hooded jacket pulled tight against the downpour. She spotted Alden among the gathering of city officials, flanked by his legal team. Councilwoman Monroe was there too, face grim. Dozens of reporters jostled for position, cameras pointed at the stately columns of the courthouse. At exactly noon, Michael Brandt stepped up to the podium. The hush that fell was profound. Umbrellas and microphones angled forward. Brandt cleared his throat. As a result of our investigation, multiple indictments will be handed down on charges including bribery, conspiracy, and falsification of public records. This extends to several sitting council members as well as city employees and developers involved in illegal property transactions. A thunderclap boomed overhead, almost on cue. The press erupted with questions, but Brandt wasn't finished. Warrants have been issued for immediate arrests. No one, regardless of position, is exempt from the law. Shockwaves tore through the crowd. Camera lights flared, capturing every stunned expression. Brandt continued, "We also want to commend those who came forward, including Ms. Jasmine Crockett, whose evidence and perseverance were instrumental in uncovering the depth of this corruption." At that, the crowd turned, looking at Jasmine. A handful of reporters began calling her name. She stood rooted, water dripping from her hood, feeling a mixture of triumph and immense gravity. She nodded at Brandt, who offered the slightest tilt of his head in acknowledgement. Then chaos took over. Some city officials tried to leave swiftly, anticipating arrests, or at least an onslaught of incriminating questions. Alden was confronted by reporters thrusting microphones in his face, demanding his response. He muttered about legal battles ahead, insisting he was innocent, but even his attorney struggled to hold back the rising tide of condemnation. Monroe stared in disbelief, her face wan. It was unclear if she faced charges or was implicated only tangentially, but the hammer had fallen and City Hall stood exposed. Jasmine stepped back from the throng, letting the moment unfold without her direct involvement. This was bigger than her personal role. The system was being dismantled by the very scrutiny it had evaded for so long. People began to cheer, a raw outpouring of relief that the injustice they'd felt in their gut was finally addressed. Tears mixed with rain on the faces of those who'd been wronged, their stories validated. She slipped away, cutting through the alleys behind the courthouse. She needed a moment to process it all. She found a quiet spot under an awning, the rain drumming a relentless beat overhead. Leaning against a brick wall, she breathed in the damp air. She had done it, or rather, the truth had done it, and she had simply been its messenger. From being laughed at in a debate to confronting the very powers that shaped her city's fate, she had taken every risk, endured every sneer, and found victory in the cold glare of the public eye. But it was not a happily ever after. Lives had been upended, both the corrupt officials and the innocent families. The city would have to pick up the pieces, and justice was a process, not a final curtain. Yet, for the first time since she began this journey, Jasmine allowed herself to feel something close to peace. The bombshell file she'd dropped had ignited a chain reaction that no one could stop. Laughter had turned to outrage, then to action. She remembered the scornful chuckles that followed her lateness, the attempts to discredit her, and she remembered the hush that fell when she produced the evidence they claimed she didn't have, the hush that signified a power shift. Now, in this rainy, gray moment, she felt the tension in her chest unclench. She gazed up at the turbulent sky, letting raindrops fall on her face. She had faced the city's contempt, peeled back the curtains of secrecy, and stood firm, unwavering. Tomorrow, she might feel the weight of it all, the exhaustion, the lingering threats, the personal cost. But today, she felt the promise of accountability. If only for a moment, the sound of mocking laughter was replaced by thunderous justice. And that, she realized, was the real victory. The truth, no longer silenced or ignored, resounding through the storms that once tried to drown it out.